here in the studio, we are joined by Ian Bremmer, and we've just been joined by Senator Chris Coons of the state of Delaware. More importantly, for the purposes of this conversation, Foreign Relations Committee. First of all, to you, Ian, what did you make of Vladimir Putin? Not just that question, but his general attitude last night.
Oh, well, the idea that he thinks he's reasonably treated by the United States not only is ludicrous to him, but also he's been riding that at the polls domestically for a good year and a half now. He's at 85%, and that's real. I think that, you know, the idea that the Russians just have been fundamentally considered a non-player on the global stage, whether we talk about NATO enlargement, they feel they were lied to about that, talk about missile defense in Eastern Europe, talk about U.S. energy policy in the Caspian. This has been a litany of Russian concerns, and of course, not all of those are true. We wouldn't accept them, but we clearly don't go out of our way to say we kind of get you, Russian. Our mantra has not just been Assad must go, which we've been talking about. It's going to go away soon, but also our mantra has been we're isolating the Russians. And the Russians are doing vastly more business with China, soon to be the world's largest economy, than since we started saying we're going to isolate the Russians. So, I mean, if you're Putin, you're asked that by Charlie Rose, you're bemused, and I think he expressed that.
And Senator Coons, welcome. First off, the tenor of our conversation has really been about the limits on how much the president can say at the UN today.
Well, I'm looking forward to a tough address by the president. My hope is that he will stand up to Putin's aggression in Ukraine, and that he will be clear that he intends to be a tough enforcer of the deal with Iran. We can work with Russia and China to accomplish forward steps in global security, like containing and limiting Iran's nuclear weapons program, while at the same time recognizing that the murderous regime of Bashar al-Assad has to go. We face a very tough tactical decision here that I expect the president will have to speak to, which is whether we work to go after ISIS first and tolerate some sort of alignment of convenience for the short term, or whether we continue to go it alone and lead an international coalition that focuses on ISIS and Assad at the same time. That will be very difficult to pull off, and I'm looking forward to what the president will have to say about that more difficult challenge.
Leading the international coalition just gets more difficult with this Russian effort.
Significantly. Putin has been very successful at inserting himself. In the previous cycle of the Syrian conflict, he at the last moment sort of secured a commitment from Assad to give up his chemical weapons. But between then and now, Russia played a very strikingly negative role in Crimea and in Ukraine, and the United States has had an opportunity to energize, engage, and mobilize Western Europe in response to that. The refugee crisis flowing out of Syria is a profound threat to Western Europe and to stability in the Middle East, and saying that we're now going to somehow team up with Assad or accept this new alignment with Iran and Assad is like saying we're going to join the arsonist in putting out the fire he helped create. It is a difficult strategic situation, but at the 70th anniversary of this UN that we helped found and that is headquartered here in New York, I think the United States is up to the challenge. Congress has to play its role. Irresponsible talk about shutting down the federal government at this moment is incredibly reckless and dangerous to America's national security. And it's my hope that with Speaker Boehner stepping down, we will not have any more talk about federal government shutdown.
I'll tell you, you don't need to be a member of Foreign Relations to look back and see the seeds of this Assad policy. You can just look back and see the DNA chain of how we got to where we are today. We've all watched it almost in slow motion.
Yes, it's been a slow motion failure to confront a very difficult situation. I do not think there were clearly better options. There were different options. But in a country that is still struggling with the very profound costs of the conflict in Iraq and the conflict in Afghanistan, while I might have chosen a different path, going into Syria in a bigger way earlier was something that was strongly resisted by many in my caucus and many in the country. I do think that we had no great options. The emergence of ISIS has made it much more complicated, and I think the Obama administration has led the efforts against ISIS in Iraq, and we will now have to see how they can tackle them in Syria.
Chris Matthews continues to join us and monitor this conversation in Washington. Chris, if you're this administration, how can you put any kind of happier face, happier tone behind this? Because people who follow it only casually know what a disaster this has been.
Well, it's a difficult conundrum, and the senator puts it well. I mean, that's not just a conservative Democratic position he gave us. That's a realist position. And I think we have look at from the beginning, the Russians were basically thrown out of the Middle East back in under Sadat when he first took over. And after Nasser, and they were gone, and now they're back. And they're back because they enjoy one permanent, enduring alliance. That's with the Assad regime and the Assad family. They're in there with the Alawites, and they're going to stick with them. And you could ask yourself, if we had had the same kind of steadfastness with our allies, if we had gone and stuck with Mubarak a bit longer, if we had avoided getting involved with Syria in terms of regime change there, if we had not gone into Iraq, how much better the situation might be. But then the other side, the conservative side, the more neocon side, if you will, can argue, well, since we did go into Iraq, we haven't done so well either. So I want to bring back Secretary Cohen. You know, you can do this both ways, but the hard way is to find forward. That's the hard gear to find here, as Brian asked.
Well, I think what the president is probably going to do is talk about the successes he's had. For example, the climate change deal with China, with the deal with Iran, saying diplomacy has worked with China on a major issue as far as climate change. I've worked a major deal with Iran in trying to stop the proliferation, and now I am prepared to work with Russia and other allies in coping with stopping ISIS in the Middle East. So I think he'll try to play his strengths to the extent they're seen as strengths, certainly not here at home, because very few people in the Congress have been supporting a position on climate change. Very few people in Congress have supported the Iran deal. But I think he'll try to play both of those and saying, I'm prepared to look at a diplomatic solution. If that means I have to side with Putin temporarily, I'm prepared to do it.
You know, the difficulty, Brian, the last thought is that he never had a clear concept to sell the American people. There's the president, First Lady, coming up the escalator. He never had anything clear. When he said we're defeating ISIS, no one believed this president. They thought he did a good job. Many people did, maybe a minority, but they really believed he did a good job with the Iranian deal. But he didn't have anything to sell, really, with regard to Syria. And here we are going back into his most vulnerable point, which is Syria and his inability to put together an alliance, whereas here comes Putin over the weekend, basically, and said, I got a plan, and we don't. So it's hard to fight with a plan when you don't really have one yourself, Brian.
Chris Matthews,
Putin
thanks.
doesn't have a Congress.
Senator Coons, you were shaking your head while Chris was speaking.
Well, let's be clear. I mean, Putin's plan is simply trying to paper over the fact that Assad has murdered hundreds of thousands of his own people. That's not a plan. That's simply trying to keep a toehold in a region of the world where, if we were to somehow accept the idea of Assad's legitimacy, we would give up what's left of our moral legitimacy in the face of his crimes. And I think it's important that the president stand firm on his leadership successes in confronting climate change, in leading to a world effort against Iran, and in saying that he will continue to lead strongly on both of those, and in challenging Russia's aggression in Europe.
We are still looking at the phalanx of aides to the president as he came during our conversation, swooping up the escalators from that ground level entrance. He will now be in a holding room prior to his time at the podium. And unlike some previous years, the First Lady is with him. You see Susan Rice behind, the Secret Service agent who's behind the president. Basically the foreign policy team apparatus for the United States. And for all the reasons we've been discussing, there is a little bit more suspense this year prior to the president's remarks. And none of that would the president prefer. The suspense is because the U.S. is in a bit of a box on this topic we've been discussing on the Middle East. Ian Bremmer, is there a voice in the administration that we may hear more loudly, more clearly than anyone else? Is this a time for someone in particular to come forward and shine and write the speech of a lifetime?
Look, I mean, Secretary Cohen's right. I mean, there are a lot of people that feel like they've had successes recently. The soon-to-be-signed Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is the most landmark trade deal that we've seen in decades, that's a big win. And again, they have the Cuba opening. There are things that they can talk about. But the real question is the one you brought up in the opening, which is American influence globally in decline? It is, and that doesn't doesn't mean America's not the only superpower. We still are, but the administration recognizes that it is, and they've articulated that in very different ways. And it's hard, on the one hand, to stand up and say we're going to resolve all these problems, and at the same time recognize that you're in an increasingly non-polar environment. The Middle East is a vacuum. The Chinese have radically different values and preferences than you do, and they're prepared to advance them. And the Russians are undermining your rule in very effective ways. American standards in the Western Hemisphere feels pretty good. We don't have the geopolitical conflicts here. We just had a landmark deal. It's going to be signed in Colombia between the government there and the FARC. 50 years of civil war. We're going to, it feels safe here. And yet, it's hard for Obama administration to give that statesman-like strategic foreign policy when at home in Congress and the constituents are saying, we really don't want you spending a lot of time or money engaging in that.
Where do you put the health and relevance of the United Nations at 70?
I think that the United Nations is incredibly relevant, but the Security Council is a moribund institution. If you think about what UNICEF or the World Health Organization, all of these outfits have done with incredibly difficult challenges, reducing poverty, dealing with, childhood mortality.
The food program.
The food program. I mean, if it wasn't for that, this refugee crisis, we would have been hearing in the headlines years before we actually washed up here. So those are wonderful things. But the Security Council doesn't work. It's unreformable, and it is a reflection of the geopolitical environment that Obama himself struggles so mightily to be able to speak to.
Andrea Mitchell is back with us. Andrea, same question. Health and relevance of the United Nations at 70.
Well, I would say that Pope Francis at 78 is a whole lot healthier and more relevant than the United Nations at 70. I have to tell you that you and I have covered this agency for decades, and one has to ask, when there was an Associated Press report last week that the World Health Organization, which was always highly regarded, totally blew the warnings of Ebola and did not take action quickly enough to protect people from the ravages of Ebola in Africa. That's just one indicator. But the other indicator is the migrant crisis and the war that preceded and caused it. What did the United Nations do, if anything, to try to ameliorate the civil war that has been raging in Syria? Now, arguably, the United States has been not adept diplomatically, nor have any of the allies, that we've all sort of ignored it until it hit Europe's front door. But the bottom line is this war has been going on for years and years, and the United Nations is supposed to be a peacekeeping force. I think there's also been, let's say, a lessening of influence of the UN Secretary General. Kofi Annan was really the last Secretary General that had large influence, and that was when he was personally committed to trying to stop the U.S. and Great Britain and the others from going into Iraq. So it's been that long since we've seen a very strong hand at the helm of the United Nations. There have been charges of corruption, and also there has been so much opposition in Congress to the United Nations, going back years and years, that we have not even lived up to our minimal funding commitments. So we don't have as much leverage as we ought to have. The one area where the United Nations, or a breakaway group from the United Nations, has been effective is the diplomacy of the so-called permanent 5+1 members of the Security Council, because it was that group that did, with leadership from the U.S., lead the negotiations with Iran. And for better or not, we'll know years from now, but that is one thing that the president is going to be pointing to, along with the Cuba initiative that has shown diplomacy can work. And Cuba was negotiated with the help of the Pope, not at all with the United Nations.
Andrea, how will they ever, you mentioned the critics in Congress, it is a favorite whipping post. How will they ever get that back? Will there ever be an event, a crisis, an initiative that will win the UN more friends, especially among conservatives and especially in Washington?
Hard to say, because all the way back when Jesse Helms was leading the opposition as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Madeleine Albright had to go through all sorts of hoops, including a softball game, including to going to North Carolina. She was the ambassador to the United Nations, and she had to basically lobby him very effectively, as did Richard Holbrooke, the late diplomat, when he was UN ambassador. So it was always in the hands of whoever was controlling the Foreign Relations Committee and the appropriations. And at the time, time it was a Republican and a very conservative one at that. It's very hard to imagine a scenario other than some major, crisis, a humanitarian crisis or a war, where the UN showed its effectiveness. But it's been a long time since we've seen real effectiveness. It was a UN-led force and NATO, of course, in Libya, but we all know how that ended up with a dysfunctional state. So the toppling of Gaddafi is hardly a way to argue for UN effectiveness.
And the view of Ban Ki-moon, you think in plain English, is nice man, perhaps not as strong or effective a man as he could be.
I think that's the case, and I think it's also the times. We're back in superpower diplomacy and in armed conflicts around the world, and this multilateral, organization, which does so much good on the ground in terms of their humanitarian efforts in most places in many unheralded ways around the world, just gets ignored, and it is not front of mind until a crisis such as this migrant crisis erupts.
Andrea Mitchell, outside the UN, we still have Chris Matthews, we have Secretary Cohen watching and listening in Washington, and we have Senator Chris Coons here with me in our New York studio. This is we're nearing the end of Brazil's time before the General Assembly, and then in front of what has become that very, very instantly recognizable, characteristic green stone backdrop, we will see President Obama, and hear how he rhetorically is going to get around the minefield we have just established. Senator Coons, since you're here, let's talk about the institution of the U.S. Senate. The Boehner effect, what do you think will happen? I mean, there are still a lot of people who want us to know a government shutdown is possible.
A government shutdown remains possible as long as there are senators running for president who think it's in their self-interest to take this fight all the way to the mat. I don't think we will see it this week, but we will adopt a short-term continuing resolution that'll keep the government open only a couple of weeks while we try again to negotiate a bigger budget deal. I just don't see how this is in America's interest. And as you and Andrew were just discussing, the United Nations, which we helped create 70 years ago to contain the spread of nuclear weapons and to deal with a massive refugee crisis right after the Second World War, seems to me more relevant than it's been in a while, because it has helped with pulling together the world community to confront Iran. It was UN Security Council resolutions that put in place the sanctions system that Congress then, in a bipartisan and effective way, pushed forward, and this administration successfully led negotiations. And the UN, through UNICEF, the World Food Program, UNHCR, is doing more to deal with the current refugee crisis than any other entity. So it's not irrelevant, but it is aging. And in a deeply divided Congress, one that is at risk of shutting down the government, we do need to find a way to come together and embrace the institutions that we helped build.